the first European by whom the present state of Mississippi was visited, appears to have been Ferdinand de Soto, a native of Badajoz in Spain, who landed on the coast of Florida on the 25th of May, 1539. Having learned from Indians that gold existed in abundance in the interior of the country, he set off with a party of several hundred men in quest of his ignis fatuus, which had already caused so much disappointment and disaster to the adventurers of that period. Led on by reports of different Indian nations whom he encountered, who uninformedly represented the precious metal at some spot at no great distance in advance, he traversed various remote districts, and after 2 years of marching and countermarching, arrived on the banks of a deep river with a strong current and muddy water, which seems to have been the Mississippi. Another year was spent in descending the river and exploring the country and its vicinity, but death put a period to his enterprises, and he was buried on the banks of the Mississippi in May 1542. Of these principal facts, no doubt can be entertained. The printed account of this expedition, however, abounds with the most romantic incidents and marvelous descriptions. Fabulous adventures in equally fabulous countries and nations are encountered by the reader in almost every page. The natives whom De Soto met, according to the historian of his travels, differed in almost every respect from the existing race of Indians, and from those whom more authentic narratives have represented as occupying the country soon after the period of his visit. We hear of walled towns, of houses built with architectural taste, thatched with reeds, and kept in a state of great cleanliness, of the houses of great lords being distinguished from those of the meaner sort of great galleries, and benches made of cane, by hangings of tapestries, and seats over which were thrown coverlets embroidered with devices of very witty and fine workmanship, and fringed round about with a fringe dyed in the color of scarlet. We find these Indians possessing churches, the steeples of which are surmounted with vanes, and fields regularly surveyed, and bound and cultivated with the method of success. We are told of queens governing populous nations, extending their authority over districts of 300 miles in extent, wearing necklaces of pearls, and navigated in barges magnificently ornamented. The Indians whom De Soto encountered were sufficiently gentle to be great admirers of music, and sufficiently credulous to suppose that their invaders could not be moved by a concord of sweet sounds. For we find that on one occasion, when the subjects of the king of Caliquin, who had been arrested by De Soto in his own territory for some breach of politeness, and who, when he attempted to make his escape from his keepers, was retaken by the aid of a bloodhound, were desirous of attaining his release, they approached the Spaniards, playing a mournful melody upon their flutes, but finding this species of remonstrance ineffectual, they were obliged to have recourse to the more natural argument of bows and arrows. Of other Indian nations, the same traveler states that they carried umbrellas over the heads of their kings, wore linen garments, used standards in time of war, and possessed dogs. Notwithstanding, they found them thus far advanced in civilization. It seems the Spaniards still considered them, in fact, as outlaws and savages, for we find them seizing the Indian kings whenever they had an opportunity, and slaughtering the people and destroying their towns on the slightest pretext. After the death of De Soto, his followers passed another year in this country, and at last, sailing down the Mississippi to its mouth, proceeded to New Spain. From this period to the descent of the Mississippi in 1683, De La Salle, little more seems to have been known of this country upon the river. The name of Louisiana, which now belongs to the state of the lower Mississippi, was at the first establishment of the colony. Applied to the territory on both sides of the river, between the lakes in the Gulf of Mexico, and between the Mexican and Allegheny Mountains. Over this vast extent of country, France claimed to have jurisdiction, in consequence of the discovery of the Mississippi by De La Salle. In 1716, the French formed a settlement at the Natchez and built a fort for its protection, which they named Rosalie. Subsequently, other settlers planted themselves among the Natchez Indians, and some penetrated to the Yazoos, where they built a fort which was destroyed by the Chickasaws in 1722. The French were favorably received by the Natchez, but the kindness of these Indians was requited by the most horrible ingratitude. In 1723, a dispute arising between an old Indian and a soldier at Fort Rosalie. The former was wantonly killed by some of the garrison. The perpetrators went unpunished, and the indignation of the Indians being excited, they attacked the French and killed many of them. At last, peace was restored, and the Indians, not suspecting the faith of those Christian colonists, threw aside their arms and were lulled into security. M. Beauville, the governor of Louisiana, availing himself of this circumstance, marched a body of 700 men to the fort, attacked the defenseless natives, and having inhumanely slaughtered a great number of them, demanded as the price of peace the heads of their principal chiefs. With this demand, they were forced to comply. But from that moment, they perceived that an extermination of the French or their own abandonment of the country must take place. Affairs, however, remained without an open rupture until 1729, when a circumstance occurred which gave a new edge to their resentment and led to the final catastrophe. M. de Chapart, governor of Fort Rosalie, was a man of an overbearing disposition and vindictive temper who had made himself odious to the Indians by different acts of injustice. Having determined to build a town, he selected with wanton cruelty the site of a village of the Natchez, then occupied by a numerous population of the unoffending people. Accordingly, he directed the chief to remove the inhabitants and plant them in another place. The Natchez, perceiving that their ruin was resolved upon, endeavored to gain time while they effected a union among themselves and an alliance with other tribes. By the promise of a tribute for each hut, they succeeded in inducing the commander to postpone the execution of his resolve until after the harvest. In the meantime, the plan of operations was concerted. The Chickasaws were invited and agreed to engage in the enterprise. But some misfortune, they mistook time at which the blow was to be struck, and they did not participate in the struggle. The French too were cautioned by a woman of the Natchez to be on their guard, but M. de Chapart blindly disregarded the counsel. At length, on the last day of November 1729, the flame burst forth. The Natchez, on pretense of offering the tribute, repaired to the fort, of which they soon got possession. A general massacre ensued. M. de Chapart fell by the hands of one of the meanest of the Indians, the chiefs disdaining to stain their hands with his blood. Of the 700 French then settled in that vicinity of Fort Rosalie, very few escaped. The settlements at Yazoo and Ouachita shared the same fate. When intelligence of this disaster reached the capital of Louisiana, effectual measures were taken to retrieve it. A detachment of troops was sent against the fort, of which the Natchez now had possession, and the Chickasaws, their former allies, now also turned their arms against them. The Natchez endeavored to provide against impending danger by fortifying the fort, but finding the strength of their adversaries too great for them, they proposed a cessation of hostilities for a day, which was agreed to by the French. During the night, they silently deserted the fort, loaded their boats with all the plunder they could carry, and crossed the Mississippi. The next morning, the French, to their utter astonishment, found an empty fort, but were not then able to pursue the fugitives, who retired about 180 miles up Red River, where they erected a fortification. The French, having obtained a reinforcement, pursued them, attacked them in their fort, and after a sanguinary struggle, compelled them to surrender at discretion. Their women and children were reduced to slavery and compelled to work on the plantations. Of the surviving warriors, a few escaped and united themselves to the Chickasaws and Creeks, among whom their ancient language is still preserved. The remainder were sold as slaves and sent to St. Domingo. The French retained an acknowledged title to the country on each side of the Mississippi until the Treaty of 1763, when they ceded their possessions east of the river to the English. In the succeeding year, the latter took possession of the posts within this territory. During the passage of a regiment upon the Mississippi to the Natchez, it was attacked by the Tunicas and defeated with great slaughter. Notwithstanding the hostile disposition of the natives, the English directed their attention to the country and began to cultivate about Natchez. By the Treaty of 1783, Great Britain relinquished the Floridas to Spain without any specific boundaries, and at the same time ceded the United States all the country north of the 31st degree. The terms of this cession opened an ample field of dispute between the United States and Spain, which continued to agitate the two nations for several years. The Spaniards retained possession of Natchez and the post north of the 31st degree until 1798, when they finally abandoned them to the United States. In the year 1800, the territory between the Mississippi and the western boundary of Georgia was erected into a distinct territory government. By treaty in 1801 at Fort Adams, the Choctaw Indians relinquished to the United States a large body of land, and other cessions have since been made. On the 1st of March, 1817, an act of Congress was passed, authorizing the people of western part of the Mississippi Territory to form a constitution and state government, and providing for the admission of the state thus formed into a union. Accordingly, a convention met in July 1817, by which a state constitution was formed, and the provisions required by the Act of Congress having been complied with, the new state of Mississippi was admitted into the Union in December following.